How you doing? It's Sam Tolley. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about the benefits of growing up poor. No, don't think I've lost my mind. I am not advocating poverty. I am not advocating that people grow up poor. All I'm saying is, for those of us that grew up poor, there were some benefits to those that understand those benefits. I'm going to talk about the benefits that I obtained from growing up poor. I see people many times being interviewed talking about they were poor when they grew up and didn't know they were poor. I didn't have that experience. I grew up poor and I knew full well that I was poor. I remember when I was raising my children, there'd be times where they talk about, there's nothing to eat, I'm hungry. I can say, without any equivocation or doubt, they have never been in a house that I fathered and there was nothing to eat. What it was there was food in there to eat, but it was food that they didn't want. They didn't know what the experience was like. I lived at a time when I said there was nothing to eat, there was nothing to eat. I remember being happy to get a box of grits and some fried bologna at 11 o'clock at night on the occasion. Now let me say this too. I don't blame the government for my poverty. That was the responsibility of my parents. And let me say this, I loved both my parents. My parents are deceased. They've been deceased for quite some time. I loved them when they were alive. I loved them when I didn't have, and I loved them when I had. So I'm not trying to besmirch them or their memory. I'm just talking about the facts. I grew up in a situation where, for whatever reason, my parents didn't stay together. They stayed in the same city. But as I grew older, even though they were married, they lived apart. I always knew my father, I always knew who he was. But I remember sometimes when they were living together, and I remember sometimes, well, most of the time when they were living apart. And I guess if I think about it right now, the main tangible or intangible, whichever way it applies, is they didn't live from a biblical worldview. My father didn't live as a Christian and my mother didn't live as a Christian when I was a child. And maybe if they would have lived with that biblical worldview, they would have toughed it out together and got past whatever circumstances hindered them. But like I said, I remember when there was no food, and I remember living as a product of the Great Society, the welfare state. Now, like I said, although I didn't blame the government for our poverty, during the Great Society, LBJ set it up in the welfare situation, money was given to the mother or the wife who had children, dependent children. If there was no man in the house, I think a better thing would have been if the government would have helped those families that needed a hand up, help getting a hand up, not a constant handout. And so, since my father wasn't home or whatever, my mother would get a check, and they would get food stamps, and then we would get this on the 1st and the 15th of each month. I remember when the food stamps came, we'd have all kinds of food. It would be really good for the first few days, but then it started getting difficult, and toward the middle of the month or the end of the month, sometimes it got exceptionally hard. So, I also remember clothing. It's weird. I see people that spend good money to go to stores to buy ripped up clothes, purposely ripped up, brand new clothes. When I was growing up, if your clothes was ripped, it was a bad thing. You know, we had a presence that we wanted to present. We wanted clean clothes with no holes. Even if you had patches on your clothes, it might have been a problem. I remember many times when school would start, I would only get a few new things, maybe a couple of new shirts, a couple of new pair of pants, and then there would be clothes that we would shop at the thrift store. I think it was the Salvation Army. I don't think there was a Goodwill when I was a kid. And I was embarrassed going to those places. Now I see people at the thrift store all the time. They love to shop at the thrift store. Young folks, old folks, people with money, people without money. The times change. It's weird, you know. So, frankly, we had some kind of costume party last year when I went to the thrift store to buy something that was dated back in the 80s. But nevertheless, when I was growing up, that was not a comfortable thing. It wasn't a comfortable thing going to the store with food stamps, and they had free lunches. I don't know if it was prideful on my part, but I wouldn't take the free lunch. I took whatever I could bring home, from home, because I was embarrassed. See, kids, another thing about growing up poor, kids would talk about you like a dog. There was no bullying laws or anything like that. You had to take it. You either grew up or you crashed and burned. So, you know, I have sort of mixed feelings on that now. I think many of our children are too soft. Just like when I was a kid, we had steel jungle gyms and merry-go-rounds and slides, and we would swing those suckers high and jump into the sand. Now I go by these schools, many of them, they got rubber jungle gyms and rubber mats on the ground. And you don't see what I used to see. A skinned up knee and Band-Aids was a daily fixture as a kid. You learn how to tolerate the injuries, and you learn how to tolerate people that didn't like you. But times are different, you know. And when I was a kid, you had to learn. You learn to love yourself regardless as of what other people thought about you. You know, it reminds me when I was a teenager, going to parties. There were people who had a little money, or family had money, and so the kids would get cars. And I remember Volkswagen clubs with their, you know, rims and, you know, bouncing up and down the street. Or there was a Chevy club. Different folks had different clubs, you know, and they had their little cute girls and whatever in their cars. And me and my buddies, we'd walk to the parties because that was the only way we'd get there. Well, when I got my first car, when I got out of high school. I graduated in 1970, and a friend of mine was going in the Army, and he was going to Vietnam. So he sold me his 1960 Chevy Impala two-door coupe for $125. Of course, I had a great time in that car until circumstances made it depart from me, which is still problematic now because I think about the value it would have these days, and I don't have it. But nevertheless, back then, it didn't have super duper paint jobs or lifts on it or fancy tires. It was a normal, clean car. You know, it didn't have any dents in it. It had a decent paint job. It looked just like every other vehicle on the street. And even though I had a job and could have fixed it up. But see, one of my benefits of growing up poor was I decided that I wasn't going to waste money trying to impress people with my vehicle. All I wanted it to do was get me to where I was going and always get me back home. And if some girl didn't like the way my car was, that was fine. I didn't care. Matter of fact, she was doing me a favor because that was somebody I could write off my list. See, that benefit taught me to care more about myself and being a better steward of my finances than wasting it on stuff I didn't need. Now, if people want to spend money on their cars, that's their business. I'm just talking about me. And when I became a parent, it also taught me, like I said, the value of food. I didn't just buy frivolous stuff. Now, I bought the kids junk food every now and then. I gave them stuff they want, but I kept it within reason. I always made sure they had the nutrients. They always had something to eat. They never had to worry about going hungry. If they went hungry, it was because they didn't want what was in there. Now, I grew up at a time that when Mama fixed the dinner, if you didn't want it, you went hungry. And I kept that. I gave them a decent food. If they didn't want it, fine, don't eat it. But you ain't getting nothing else. It's just like I never bought my kids all these designer clothes. I was going back to the clothes thing. I remember they would have all these fancy clothes that cost extra money. And people getting up at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning to buy Jordans. It never happened. I'd make sure they got decent clothes, they got good clothes, and they didn't have to worry about going to the Salvation Army to get extra clothes. But I was not going to be controlled by the media or the styles or any of that junk. I was going to do what was right. I wasn't a rich man growing, as a young family owner. I remember a time when the kids were saying, well, Dad, why don't you buy a bunch of lights and stuff for outside the house and make the house all pretty for Christmas? Now, we had a tree. We didn't have a problem with that, and we decorated it in the inside. But I told the kids, I tell you what, would you rather me spend the money on the lights on the outside of the house, or would you rather me buy you presents with it? Well, wisdom kicked in, and they said the presents. I said, fine, good. That's what I did. I tried to show them the value of money. I tried to show them how I had to be a good steward and how I had to take care of a family. Because, see, when I was a kid, being impoverished meant, my house, we never owned a house when I was a kid. I moved so many times that I can't keep track of. I'd have to sit down and consciously try to figure out how many different residencies I lived in. That's what I would have to do, to try to remember. I remember we had to move. There was time we had to stay with people. There were difficult days, But my kids, at the most, they stayed in 2 homes. And both homes were homes that I was able to put my name on the grant deed. As a matter of fact, in my lifetime, I've been able, by the grace of God, to be in ownership of 3 different houses. But that was part and parcel of the benefit of being poor. I did not want to live from pillar to post. I did not want to be worrying about where I was going to stay or how I was going to have a roof over my kids' head. Those memories of what I went through made it so there were times where I had a job where I couldn't stand my employer. I remember there was a song, a country song that says, take this job and shove it. And there were times where I thought about telling a particular employer to do just that. Well, common sense came in. The realization that if I did that, I would feel great for about 5 minutes. And then I would have to figure out, now what am I going to do next? And of course, thinking about the fact that I was a parent, and I wasn't going to be the type of parent that unfortunately I lived under. I was going to make sure I took care of my responsibility. So I didn't do that. I had to learn, matter of fact, I even had to learn how to forgive people. I had to learn how to forgive an employer that I thought abused me. I had to take it to God. And God took care of me. He's always taking care of me. That's another thing you learn, or I learned to depend on God, to always depend on Him, not just when things are bad. It's easy for us to run to God when things are bad. To ask God to take care of us, to ask God to help us. But just think about it. If you're a parent, and you have adult children, how do you feel, or how would you feel if the only time they came to you is when they wanted something? Or even your young kids avoid you and they don't come to you unless they want something. Now, as a parent, you're going to do whatever you can for your kid. I try to do whatever I can for mine. Growing up, I try to help mine where I can, reasonably, as an adult. But, just like me, I believe my Heavenly Father doesn't want to just hear from me when times are bad. He wants to hear from me all the time. And that's why I try to pray to Him every day and try to let Him know how much I love Him, how much I appreciate Him. Now, I don't expect my kids to call me and talk to me every day. But I think it's a good thing when they do. Now, one of the greatest things I learned from being poor was humility. Was to not think of myself better than anybody else. Never to get to the point where I get what we used to call the big head. Because as high as you go, that means you're going to fall a whole lot further. You know, the benefit to never forget where you came from and what you went through. You know, and when you see people that are impoverished now or struggling like you may have or whatever the situation, never to think little of them, never to think that you're better than them. There's always going to be somebody that's got more than you. So keeping up with the Joneses is nonsense. And I thank the Lord that I never had to think about that, you know, because I knew I couldn't keep up with them. So being an adult, I never forget that. I don't care what other people have, what they do. God bless them. They got it. You know, all I want to do is take care of me, mine, be happy in my own life, and do the best that I can. Do the best that I can as far as, you know, trying to be a servant of the Lord. And this brings me to another thing that I learned from being poor. Like I said, when you're a kid, you get talked about like a dog. At least we did in my age, you know. And you have to learn how to have thick skin. Well, that thick skin that I developed helped me as an adult. Because I make a lot of videos, and I make a lot of videos talking about religion and politics. And I make a lot of people, unfortunately, upset. I'm not trying to make people upset. I'm trying to give people my perspective. I'm trying to tell people what I think is true. And I invite them to talk to me. Many of them don't, some of them do. But many people get angry, call me all kinds of names and all kinds of stuff. Well, if I hadn't went through what I went through growing up, it might deter me. But it doesn't deter me, you know, particularly if I think I'm right. And I invite people to show me where I'm wrong because, like I said, the humility part, being humble, you have to open yourself up for the possibility that you're wrong. And if somebody shows you where you were wrong, then you need to be man enough to admit it and to change. I'll never forget with my kids. My sons used to cut their hair in the bathroom, and I said, don't use a vacuum cleaner. You know, just use a mop or a rag or whatever. So one day I decided to cut my hair in the bathroom. And I used a vacuum cleaner. I said, dang, that worked a whole lot better. I told them, you know what, you were right. I was wrong. That's another benefit that I have. And I don't think that's so much of being poor, but generational. My parents never, ever admitted when they were wrong. You know, that generation, I don't think folks did that sort of thing. But when I was wrong, and I'm raising kids, and I found out that I was wrong, I'd go to them and say, you know what? I was wrong. I don't think I lost any authority at that point. In fact, I think I enhanced my authority because I was able to admit my mistake. And I never relinquished my title as parent. You know, I wasn't trying to be my children's friend. I was just trying to be an honest parent. So I just wanted to throw out a couple of those things about benefits of being poor. I don't wish poverty on anybody. I wish everybody the best that they can get. And that taught me to go after the best that I can get. That taught me to not waste time in school, which I did as a child. I wasted many years. It took me a long time to decide to get serious about everything. And I also learned not to use race or nationality or any of that stuff as a crutch. Nobody owed me nothing. I had to do for myself with the help of God. And with the help of God, I was able. You're able. So if you're like me and you grew up poor and you succeeded, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. If you grew up poor and you're saying that somebody's holding you down, get out from underneath that person and get up. This is Sam Tolley, and I'm out.